good day to be alive, and we're back with another video. So today, we got the Turbo Hayabusa all torn apart. Excuse the mess, it's kind of a war zone in here. I think I've used that terminology in a bunch of videos, but we keep working. Every time we do something new. So today we have this all torn apart. Unfortunately, I was riding it to work the other day, and my oil light just started flashing and then stayed solid red, and the bike started knocking like pretty much immediately as it started blinking. So my theory was that I spun a rod bearing, and we're starting to tear it apart now, and that's proven to be true. So here we have the engine out of the chassis, started tearing into it, and what I found is the pistons weren't too happy. You could see there's some detonation over there. The top of the piston actually broke off on the bottom of that piston right there, and I thought this was completely stock. I thought it had stock pistons and rods. I pulled the clutch cover off, and the rods appeared to be stock, but upon pulling them apart, I never looked at the pistons. I saw the rods and saw those were stock, and those are always the weak point people change. People run the stock pistons up to 500 horsepower, so I didn't think that was even an issue. Looking at these aftermarket pistons, this number 1 or 4 right here really got chewed up, and you could see the top of the pistons broke off right there, and you could see the second ring right there. And there's all kinds of detonation, and just looks like a war zone in there. Unfortunately, the block is nicked up top right there, so I don't think it'll be salvageable, which is really unfortunate. I'm going to get the new pistons in, and we're going to go with 81 millimeter anyway, and I'm going to measure how far that detonation is and see if rings will even touch that, because if the rings don't touch it, then I might just leave that, to be honest. I can even have a buddy weld it up, but it is nickel plated. I don't want to start messing with that, but unfortunately, the head's going to have to be replaced or repaired. I'm going to go ahead and replace it if I do end up using this head. You could see that on the 1 and 4 pistons that both had damage, there's damage to the head as well. And I'm not a big fan of welding them up and trying to repair them. This number 1's really bad. You could see that there's a chunk taken out of next to that intake valve right there. There's a whole chunk missing. So this head's kind of as good as gone. If it was a naturally aspirated build and we were just going stock power, I wouldn't worry about it. I'd have it welded up and just run that, because you're not really pushing the engine at that point. It's bone stock. But when you're cramming tons of boost in there, you're effectively upping your compression ratio, higher cylinder pressures. I don't want to higher heat. I don't want to risk it by having that head repaired. So I know I need a new head. Might need a new set of barrels too, which is unfortunate. The head gasket held though. The head gasket was actually in really good shape. The engine studded, as you guys probably saw before. I didn't know that the engine was studded, so that's a big upgrade to me. It has the studs and the nut combo from APE, it looks like, so that's a pretty big upgrade I'm pumped about. It saves me about $100, but shoes unfortunately are going to cost me thousands, so to save $100 to lose thousands isn't it's not really that great of a deal. But regardless, the bike was going to need studs anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. But we're going to go ahead and pull these barrels off, see what the rods look like. Again, I was certain that they were stock rods, and whoever built this engine might have been misinformed out of like what the weak points were in these engines. The weak points were definitely the rods. The pistons are really good, not really an issue. But we're going to tear it down further and see what is all done to this engine. I think it has an undercut transmission just based on how the bike shifts. It really locks into gear, and it's notchy, but it's certain when you shift it. So I think there's transmission work. I was told they had a heavy-duty output shaft too, so we're going to verify all that right now. All right, so we got our bottom end all together. What we're going to do is, in order to hit the 500 horsepower mark, you really don't need this billet upgraded clutch basket, but the bike actually already had this basket in it. I upgraded the transmission countershaft here to an upgraded billet steel countershaft. Normally the countershafts on these, they reduce in diameter over where the sprocket is. This one keeps the same diameter the whole way through the shaft. If you're making anything over 300 horsepower on one of these Hayabusa engines, that's one of the main upgrades you should be looking at. Another thing I did is I put these knockoff Carrillo rods in it. These are from eBay. They are tested, tried and true. They are max speeding rods. But I ended up upgrading the rod bolts. I'll show you guys. They're H-beams, just like the Carrillos. Nice rod with a bronze bushing in the end. But I did upgrade these rods with ARP 625 plus rod bolts, which are about the cost of the rods, which kind of negates the cheapness factor. But these rods with these bolts are good for, 600 plus horsepower. But without further ado, we're gonna get the lower case half on it, start building the top end, and show you guys what I got for parts there in order to make this happen. Now with this bottom end, I have a few tricks up my sleeve as well. I upgraded the oil pressure regulator right here, so it's going to put out more pressure entirely. And I also welded up my balancer shaft right there. I welded up the small oil hole right here, which would normally oil this balancer, which I'm just going to completely get rid of. They sell off-the-shelf balancers you could buy. They're probably only $30 or $45 shipped to your door, but I forgot to order one, and I figured might as well just weld it up. Welded up all the oil galleries, and this one is essentially doing the same thing as one of the aftermarket ones would. I also put a new strainer on. If you're ever rebuilding an engine, you should always check the oil screen. So we're on to the next day now. The cases are together. I went ahead and got everything torqued down. The bottom end is just about ready to go. It needs all the accessories like the alternator, the clutch, the starter gear on the other side. I just wanted to give you guys a close-up of these max speeding rods to really show you what they're about. Now, they claim they're the same material as a Carrillo rod. I believe it's chromoly 4340. These are considerably thicker than a Carrillo, though. They do weigh more. The rod bolts are a coarser thread than the Carrillo. The Carrillo's a little bit of a finer thread. But overall, they're a really beefy rod. They're $300 a set. The oiling hole is on top, which isn't ideal. Ideally, you'd want it either on the bottom here so that it scoops up oil every time the piston goes down, or a channel up going through the big end of the rod all the way through up to the small end. That would be ideal, but they're going to work nonetheless. They're going to handle all the power I'm ever going to throw at it, and I don't think the wrist pins are going to overheat. You can see here's my pistons I'm going to use. These are Wasner 81 millimeter 10-to-1 tall duct turbo pistons. With these pistons, it does require a spacer plate, so we have to put an 80,000 spacer plate along the bottom of the cylinder here. I'm going to go ahead and get the other two rods all finished up, get the pistons on, get the block on, get the accessories on, and get this build going. Get it fired up pretty soon here. One thing I forgot to mention is the engine also has APE studs. I might have said that earlier, but it also has the studs, the washers, and the nuts all from APE. Get a better, get a stronger torque reading than the traditional bolts that go into here. And the problem with the bolts is every time you use them, you're screwing, the bolts into the cases. It starts to wear out the threads in the cases, whereas you don't get that with the studs. And with the studs, the torque you apply to the bolt is, it's really not going into it like the twisting action. It's more just pulling up on this rod, which pulling up on the stud more directly, so you'll get a truer torque value as well. With these, you could also torque them a few more foot-pounds than you would be able to the traditional bolts. They have more thread engagement going into the cases, so they go a little bit deeper down. And also, they're just a better material. So overall, it really is a better solution than the stock setup. But without further ado, let's get this block on. It's really starting to shape up now with all the pistons on. Let's get that block on. Another successful night in the books for the Hayabusa. Got the jug on. All my pistons in there. Now, I don't have the block all the way down right now. I didn't put sealant on the spacer plate yet. I'm going to put Gazga cinch sealer on both sides. And the reason I didn't put the sealer on yet is because I'm not putting the head on yet. Ideally, I want the gasket maker that I'm going to put on this spacer plate to not be dry by the time I'm putting on the head. So that way, when you tighten it all down, you know, the gasket maker is not going to already be hardened. You're going to get a true torque reading. And also, when I get the head on and torque it all down, I'm going to wait a night and then re-torque everything again, let everything settle in. That's less of a problem with like when you're doing, you know, metal spacer plates, metal head gaskets. But if you're using a fiber head gasket like this old 6-cylinder Honda, then you're definitely going to want to tighten it, re-torque it again. It's the best thing to do. But made really good progress on this today. I got the whole starter clutch assembly in. We got the clutch in, about 90%. I'm just waiting on the new springs to come in before we really wrap it all up. Even though I'm running the billet basket, like ideally I'd be running a lock-up clutch, something like that, because that's going to be one of my main limiting factors with how much power I can make is how much can the clutch hold. Now, with the clutch setup that I'm going to put in it, it should be good for over 300 horsepower, probably around 350. But anything more than that, it's going to need, you know, an NLR boost compensating clutch or a lockup style multi-stage lockup. But that's for down like in the future. Right now, we're just going to get it running on pump gas, make 300, 350 horses with no issue. Ball with it. But I'm pretty pumped on the progress. Just waiting on those valve springs to be put on and get this thing wrapped up. 600 horsepower ready. Now, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but I gapped these rings to 22 thousandths or 0.55 millimeters for the top ring, and on the bottom ring I did 0.6 millimeters or 26 thousandths. That was recommended by Wassner for heavy duty, high output turbo applications. So since it's their pistons, I'm going to trust their word with the gap I do run. Normally I wouldn't run that much, but I'm getting all together. But next clip, we're going to get the head on. I'm going to explain what I did to the head to make all this power, which is basically just valve springs. You know, the heads themselves are really bulletproof. If you're just running pump gas, you actually don't even need to upgrade the valve springs on a Gen 1 Hayabusa. But once you run about 15 pounds or more, you start running into issues with valve float, and you're not going to have a good time if, you know, the valve hits the piston, especially at high RPMs. So without further ado, let's roll into the next clip where I put the head on. So the head's now done in the Hayabusa. We went ahead and swapped our original springs with 65-pound APE Hayabusa springs. And here's my tool. I just have this drill with a valve spring compressor, and I just basically use the electric drill as a feature to quickly basically screw these retainers down, pop the springs out, swap the new springs in, pop the retainer, the keepers and retainer back on, and just did all 16. It's ready to go. So to note about these springs is they're actually progressive. So if you look at it, the coil is a little more tightly wound at the bottom here as opposed to the top. And same with this inner spring. Now what you want to be weary of is the part that's tightly bound you want towards the head. So you want this facing down in your head, just like that. Now, the reason you do that is because the portion that's not as tightly wound up here is going to be compressing most of the time. So in order to prevent, basically the closer the coil is wound right here, it has more of a chance of binding. And that could be an issue. I mean, granted, once the spring compresses, it doesn't really matter anyway, but there could be a delay in how the valve reacts based on if these are upside down or right side up. So general rule of thumb, unless stated otherwise with these progressive springs, is to run the tightly wound portion towards the head. And that's what I've done in the past with success. But we're going to go ahead. I got the surface all cleaned up. Normally you should never put a head like this surface facing a material, but I have some like shop rags laid down just so it doesn't scratch the surface of the head. I'm pretty anal about that, but she's all done now. Let's slap it on the engine block here and call it a night. Cylinders are all brake cleaned up. Got the cylinder pressed down all the way. Put gasket cinch around the spacer plate on the top and bottom side. You can see the pistons sit about 15 to 20 thousandths below the deck surface. which is about what we want. This still is going to have a good squish despite being 10-to-1 compression. It's looking mighty fine. Let's throw the head gasket on, throw the head on, get it all torqued up. So we're moving at a pretty good pace here. I went ahead and got all the valve train installed. The cams degreed in with their adjustable APE cam wheels. I set my lobe centers at 104 for the intake and 106 for the exhaust. 3 or 4 of the valves were out of spec, so I went ahead and swapped some shims around. I had some new ones on hand. Got that all taken care of. Clutch is all tidied up too. This is pretty standard. This is pretty much the same as stock. The only thing I did different was we put in some crazy APE springs for $50. It's the highest spring rate you can get. They're 40 pounds heavier than stock springs, and they should be good for about 300 horsepower. But got this cover back on. Got the stator cover back on this side. I'm going to go ahead and throw this valve cover on, and the engine itself should be done. And we're going to put the turbo kit on before we go ahead and got to cover my address. It's on a piece of mail right there. But we'll get the turbo and the header all on. I'll shine all this up before we put it all back together, clean up that gasket surface. And yeah, let's throw this in the bike tonight. Here we go. It's now ready to put back into the chassis. We got the turbo mounted. Here's our dirty Garrett GT3071 turbocharger. Repainted the header. I added this support back here. The header had actually cracked, had a hairline crack around this weld right here. So I had a buddy repair that and then add the support so that that doesn't happen next time. But now that the engine's fully dressed up with all its covers, all its componentry, it's ready to go into the bike and fire up. The fun part is here to actually get this back into the chassis. It's a very heavy engine, especially with all the turbochargers fully dressed up, fully kitted. It's getting late in the night, but I think I have the energy to do this solo. So let's see what we can do. I had a fun time last night getting this engine single-handedly into the chassis. I don't know if I showed I got the turbo kit and everything on. It's just about there though. We just have to wrap up, do all the wiring, get all the radiator back on, all the boost lines. There's still quite a bit of work, but we're getting really down to the wire here, so I'm really pumped. But today is the day. It's gonna run within the next few hours, so I'm just gonna button it all up and hopefully it sounds great. I know it will though. It's been a long road to get here, but the bike is finally all kitted up. This is actually my second time getting the bike all together. I got the engine in the frame like you guys saw in the last clip, but unfortunately, due to user, I ended up having to pull it all back apart. I forgot one of the oil seals just for the valve cover gasket, but getting the cover back in when the engine was back in the frame was nearly impossible. So I went ahead and pulled her back out and put it all back in. It's fully kitted. Pop the hood here. Get that open. Here's my Han Stage 1 Turbo Kit Plenum. That's the only thing left from the Han kit. Here's some custom straps I made to hold the intake manifold on. Got my fuel pressure regulator, fuel pressure gauge right there. Pretty standard setup. Big Walboro 355 fuel pump right there next to the frame rail. But without further ado, this is the second start right here. Just started it up a second ago. Put the phone down. It purrs like a kitten, it really does. Even though I have the balancer removed from the engine, it's actually a lot smoother than it was before. And I had the balancer properly timed too, but sounds really healthy. Let's go take it for a ride.